In 1857, Savannah's cobblestone streets carried more than the scent of salt and smoke. They carried whispers. Whispers of lives cut short, of grief etched into every brick of the old houses. Among the shadows of moss-laden oaks, a small orphan girl claimed to remember every death the town had ever known. The townsfolk dismissed her at first, seeing only the hollow cheeks and haunted eyes of a child. But then came the names, the dates, the intimate details no one else could know. Some say it was mere coincidence. Others whispered of curses older than the city itself. And as the fog rolled in from the river, as the lanterns flickered in the night, a chilling question arose. Could a child truly hold the memory of death itself? Or had Savannah birthed something far darker, hidden behind the innocence of a single small voice? In the bitter chill of early January 1857, Savannah's streets were slick with frost, the brackish scent of the nearby river curling through the narrow alleys. Horses' hooves clattered against cobblestones, mingling with the faint murmur of early risers and the metallic creak of wagon wheels. Into this world of fog and industry stepped the orphan girl, appearing suddenly at the doorstep of the city's modest orphanage on East Broad Street. Her hair, dark and matted with winter's grime, framed a pale, thin face whose hollow cheeks seemed too old for her years. Yet it was her eyes that unsettled all who saw her, large, glassy, and unnervingly perceptive, as if she had witnessed every tragedy the city had ever known. The matron, Mrs. Caldwell, was a woman of stern habits and little patience for theatrics. She watched the girl with a practiced gaze, noting how her small boots scuffed the floorboards and how her thin hands clutched the hem of her worn dress. The girl said nothing at first, only studying the room with a silent intensity that left Mrs. Caldwell feeling naked and exposed. It was when she sat in the corner that evening, rocking slightly and murmuring names, that unease began to seep into the orphanage's walls. Names of people the matron knew had long been dead. Dates precise and exact. Circumstances. The color of the deceased's eyes at the final breath. The position of their hands, the faintest scent lingering in the room. The city itself seemed to shift in her presence. Savannah's brick facades and moss-draped oaks, the lingering echoes of ship bells and market calls, all became a backdrop for whispers of the girl's strange knowledge. Caretakers began to note her uncanny behavior. She would pause in front of certain homes, lips moving in quiet utterances, staring at doors as though they contained a secret she alone could perceive. Children who had once run freely through the orphanage's hallways now gave her a wide berth, as though instinct recognized her difference. Even the older, hardened staff could not shake a creeping dread that followed her like a shadow. By the end of her first week, Mrs. Caldwell began to question her own senses. One evening, the girl looked directly at her, eyes glistening in the candlelight, and whispered a name Mrs. Caldwell had not heard in decades, a family friend long deceased. The matron froze, heart thundering in her chest. Savannah's winter fog pressed against the windows, muffling the sounds of the city, as though the streets themselves had quieted to listen. Minnie Hook cliffhanger. When the first death occurs in the very house the girl had stared at, a fear unlike any other takes root in Savannah. Perhaps this child remembers more than the past. Perhaps she remembers what is yet to come. Within days of the orphan's arrival, Savannah's calm veneer began to crack. The first death came quietly, almost unremarkably, yet it set the city on edge. Old Thomas, a retired sea captain whose laughter had once echoed across the riverfront, was found slumped in his study. The candlelight flickered against the walls, casting grotesque shadows over the ship models that lined the room. His face was frozen in shock, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, as if he had seen some final unspoken truth. It was not the death itself, but the timing that unsettled the townsfolk. The orphan had spoken his name hours earlier, whispering the details of his demise in a tone that suggested certainty rather than imagination. Then, only 2 nights later, Mrs. Abernathy, a devout woman known for her weekly prayers at the First Baptist Church, was discovered lifeless in her parlor. The family claimed it was natural causes, yet the circumstances echoed the orphan's words exactly. Savannah's residents began to murmur. Coincidence could no longer explain the pattern. The child's presence had transformed from an oddity into a source of dread. Shops closed early, windows shuttered against the encroaching night, and even the city's wealthiest families found themselves double-checking locks and doors. Yet the orphan remained calm, almost dispassionate. She moved silently among the crowds, occasionally whispering names under her breath, names that belonged to people who were still very much alive, yet whose shadows seemed to stretch longer, as though death were already leaning toward them. Passers-by would sometimes pause, heart pounding, drawn irresistibly to her voice despite the unease it sparked. It was impossible to look away from her eyes, the way they seemed to pierce straight into the soul. Savannah itself felt smaller under her gaze, the streets heavier, the fog from the river more oppressive. Rumors began to circulate. Some claimed the girl was cursed, others insisted she had been marked by the city's lingering history of yellow fever and maritime tragedies. And as fear spread, so did fascination. Townspeople debated quietly in candle-lit parlors. Could a child truly know death before it arrived? Or had Savannah itself conjured something unnatural, using the orphan as its vessel? Tell me in the comments, if you lived in this town, would you have stayed or run? Could you face a child who knows the ending before it begins? As the orphan settled into Savannah, her whispers began to reveal the city's hidden sorrows. Savannah, with its stately squares, moss-draped oaks, and elegant brick mansions, had always seemed picturesque to outsiders. But beneath the polished facades lay layers of tragedy, long buried and often ignored. The girl spoke of deaths that had been swept into quiet corners of history. Children lost to scarlet fever, sailors claimed by the treacherous river tides, servants who vanished in the night without record. Each uttered name and detail sent shivers down the spines of those who listened. The city felt smaller, heavier, as though the streets themselves remembered what people wished to forget. Residents began to notice that the orphan's observations were not random. She would linger near certain houses, muttering under her breath in tones barely audible, recounting lives of those who had perished decades ago. She described yellow fever outbreaks with chilling precision, down to the day the first patient fell ill, the very scent that lingered in the fevered rooms, the grim arrangements of bodies awaiting burial. Even long-standing families began to feel the weight of guilt and fear, realizing that Savannah's history of loss was never as distant as they believed. At the docks, sailors whispered about the girl's predictions, recounting how she named crew members lost at sea years before, describing the exact conditions of their deaths, the gusts of wind, the splintered boards, the cries swallowed by water. Merchants in the marketplace noticed how she would pause near particular homes, staring intently as if reading invisible inscriptions carved into the bricks themselves. Conversations hushed in her presence. Even the wind seemed to soften, carrying her words further than anyone expected. The orphan's uncanny knowledge forced the city into reflection. People began to examine their own family's secrets, the illnesses kept hidden, the debts that had ruined lives, the accidents no one spoke of. Savannah, a city proud of its charm and culture, was revealed to be a town shaped by suffering and unspoken tragedies. Yet the girl never gloated. She simply observed, recording each life with an eerie calm. Imagine this was your family, what would you have done? Could you endure a child who knows every sorrow that has touched your home? Tell me in the comments, would you face the truth or hide behind closed doors? By mid-February, Savannah's foggy evenings carried more than the scent of the river. They carried a sense of expectation, of dread. The orphan, who had long walked silently among the city's streets, now paused before a house in the historic district, her gaze fixed and unblinking. Inside, the occupants, a family of merchants, went about their daily routines unaware of the attention drawn to their home. The girl whispered the family's names softly, almost as if speaking to herself, and then, with a clarity that made the air itself grow heavy, she declared that someone would die within the week. At first, the townsfolk dismissed it as childish imagination, but when news of a death occurred just 2 days later, the atmosphere shifted. Savannah's residents began to treat her words as prophecy, fearing the inevitability she carried like a shadow. The girl's predictions were never vague. She described not only the names but the circumstances, the very sensations surrounding the moment of death, the temperature of the room, the subtle sounds of the house, the final expressions etched upon a face. Those who heard her could not shake the images, nor could they ignore the pattern forming in their midst. The family whose home had been singled out became increasingly anxious. Windows were barred, lanterns kept burning through the night, and servants whispered prayers under their breath. But no precautions could prevent the truth she foretold. On the predicted day, The family's youngest daughter succumbed suddenly to a fever no physician could halt, her death eerily matching every detail the orphan had spoken. The city recoiled in horror. Savannah, a town accustomed to loss, found itself haunted by a presence that seemed to know the threads of fate before anyone else could. Whispers spread through taverns, markets, and churchyards alike. People debated feverishly. Was the girl cursed or merely the vessel for some deeper, incomprehensible knowledge? Some argued that fate itself had chosen her as messenger, while others claimed the city itself was complicit, its cobblestones and oaks bearing the weight of centuries of untold deaths. Even the most rational townspeople found their sleep disturbed by her haunting voice, by the certainty in her gaze. Would you have heeded her warning or ignored it? If a child could foretell death in your own household, would you confront the truth or turn away and pray it passes? Tell me in the comments. How far would you go to protect those you love? Savannah had never known a winter as tense and silent as that which followed the orphan's predictions. Once bustling streets became corridors of unease, each passerby glancing nervously over their shoulder as though the fog itself carried judgment. Families shuttered windows and barred doors, merchants stayed close to hearths, and church bells tolled with a hollow resonance that echoed through the mist-laden city. The orphan, seemingly unaffected, wandered freely, her small feet tracing familiar paths as she murmured the names of those yet to fall. The town's elite convened in candle-lit parlors, debating what should be done. Physicians were summoned, ministers prayed, and city officials held tense councils, yet no one could explain the child's uncanny knowledge. Savannah's history, laden with epidemics, duels, and shipwrecks, provided context but no comfort. Even the most rational voices admitted a creeping fear. The child seemed to see the invisible currents of death, mapping them with terrifying precision. Parents clutched their children, servants whispered prayers, and the river fog thickened as if the city itself had drawn a veil over its own streets. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the girl was possessed by spirits of the dead, sent to warn the living. Others said she was cursed, an embodiment of the city's accumulated grief. Even children who had once played freely on the squares avoided her, sensing a darkness that transcended age and reason. At night, merchants spoke of lights flickering inexplicably in homes she had visited, and the distant creak of shutters in empty houses sounded like footsteps following her trail. Every whispered prediction that came true added fuel to the mounting hysteria. Yet not all viewed her with fear. A few, drawn by curiosity or fascination, followed her through the streets, observing the pattern she traced through Savannah's history. They noted the precision with which she spoke, the unwavering clarity in her eyes, and the eerie calm that accompanied each pronouncement. Even as dread mounted, there was a strange compulsion to witness the next revelation, to hear her utter the next name, as though knowledge of fate itself held a twisted allure. If you lived in Savannah at this time, would you hide from her or follow her every step? Could you bear to hear the names of those you loved, spoken with certainty of what was to come? Tell me in the comments, would you flee or confront the truth? As the orphan's presence unsettled Savannah, some townsfolk began to investigate her uncanny knowledge. They pored over old parish records, death registers, and cemetery logs, attempting to understand how a child could speak with such precision about lives long ended. The city, with its elegant squares and hidden alleyways, had always harbored secrets, victims of yellow fever epidemics, shipwrecks, accidental drownings, and duels long concealed by family reputations. The girl's words aligned with the darkest corners of these histories, revealing truths that had been quietly buried beneath time, moss, and polite society. At the old Christchurch cemetery, caretakers noted how she lingered over gravestones, reading names as though reciting familiar stories. Her finger would trace the etched letters, pausing briefly before whispering the manner of death, the age, even the last words of the departed. Those who followed her in secret reported a chill in the air, a dampness that seemed heavier than the winter fog outside. Some swore they heard faint whispers, faint cries that the city had carried with it for decades, as if the dead themselves were speaking through her. Among the wealthiest families, anxiety turned to obsession. Hidden histories of scandal and tragedy surfaced as servants, anxious to explain the orphan's knowledge, revealed secrets long kept under lock and key. Letters written by ancestors, journals detailing hidden fevers and sudden deaths, and private church records all corroborated the girl's eerie proclamations. Savannah's facade of civility began to crack, exposing a city built not only on commerce and charm, but on grief and inevitability. The orphan, however, remained calm. She never explained how she knew these things, never offered comfort nor sought reward. She seemed merely a vessel, a recorder of the city's past sins and its unalterable fates. Her presence forced the citizens to confront the uncomfortable truth. Savannah's history was alive in her words, pressing against the present with silent insistence. The air of inevitability grew heavier each day, and families whispered of curses older than the city itself, wondering whether the girl was a harbinger or simply a witness to what history demanded. Would you have dared to follow her into the city's hidden corners, uncovering truths long buried? Could you face the stories she revealed without turning away? Tell me in the comments, would you seek the past or leave it undisturbed? The Savannah River had always been the lifeblood of the city, its tides carrying ships, trade, and whispers of far-off lands. But in 1857, it seemed to carry something else. A voice that only the orphan could hear. On cold, fog-draped mornings, she would wander the riverfront, eyes fixed on the water as if reading messages in its restless currents. Merchants unloading cargo or fishermen casting nets would catch glimpses of her small frame, still and silent, murmuring names that had long been forgotten, names of sailors who had drowned, of steamboat passengers lost to fever, of children claimed by the river's icy edge. It was on such a morning that a local dockhand, Thomas Grayson, approached her cautiously. "Do you know who fell in the water last week?" he asked, expecting a vague guess. The orphan's eyes lifted to meet his, calm and unwavering. She whispered not only the man's name, but the exact hour, the precise manner in which he slipped, the details of the small ripples that marked his passing, and the lingering scent of the river in his hair. Thomas stepped back unsettled, realizing that her knowledge was not limited to the living city, but extended into the secrets held by the waters themselves. Word spread quickly along the waterfront. Sailors and dock workers who had lost comrades, friends, and family began to seek her out. She would sit quietly, recounting deaths from decades past, describing the weather, the ship's bell, even the sound of water slapping against hulls. It was a history of tragedy preserved in human memory, and now voiced by a child who should have known nothing. Some began to believe the river itself spoke through her, carrying the accumulated grief of centuries. Yet as fascination grew, so did fear. Stories circulated of the orphan staring at the river for hours, lips moving silently, only to turn and name someone who would die the next week, far from its banks. Families living near the waterfront barricaded doors, their children warned to stay away from her presence. The river, once a source of commerce and livelihood, now seemed like a harbinger of inevitability, its fog and tide echoing her predictions. If a child could read the river and tell you who would not survive, would you have dared to stand at the shore? Could you hear its whispers without trembling? Tell me in the comments, would you confront the river's secrets or turn away before it revealed your own? Savannah, once a city united by trade, faith, and routine, began to fracture under the weight of the orphan's presence. Whispers of her knowledge spread quickly, dividing families, neighbors, and even the city council. Some believed she was a divine messenger, sent to remind them of life's fragility. Others whispered of curses, old and malevolent, suggesting the child was a vessel for something far darker than mere memory. The fog-filled streets, which had always carried the sound of river bells and horse hooves, now echoed with suspicion and fear. In the markets, arguments erupted over whether the orphan should be ignored or watched. Shopkeepers refused to let her linger, yet some secretly left her coins or small offerings, hoping to appease whatever force guided her. Families locked doors, barred windows, and even prayed at night. Yet none could escape the inevitability she seemed to carry with her small, silent steps. Friends who once walked arm in arm through the squares now kept distance, unsure whether a glance could mark them for her next prediction. Savannah had become a city of the cautious, a city haunted by the knowledge of its own mortality. The divisions ran deeper. Ministers debated whether her knowledge was a warning from God or a test of faith, while physicians argued over natural causes versus the impossible. Citizens formed factions. Some sought to protect her, believing her to be innocent yet crucial. Others demanded she be removed, imprisoned or worse, out of fear of what her presence foretold. Public gatherings turned tense. Conversations halted as the orphan entered a room, her gaze alone enough to silence the loudest voices. Even children were affected. Those who had once played freely now whispered to one another about the girl who knew too much. Some avoided her entirely, while a few braved curiosity, daring to hear the next name, the next date, the next unchangeable truth. And as Savannah divided, the girl remained unmoved, her eyes absorbing the fractured city like a still pond reflecting a storm above. If your town suddenly split between those who feared and those who followed a single child, where would you stand? Would you protect her, condemn her, or hide from her gaze entirely? Tell me in the comments, how far would you go to survive in a city where knowledge of death divided friend from friend? As Savannah grappled with fear and fascination, a strange presence began to manifest alongside the orphan. Residents reported glimpses of fleeting shadows in their homes, doors left ajar despite careful locks, and whispers that carried through the night without explanation. Some claimed these disturbances coincided with her predictions, as though an unseen force followed her steps, amplifying the dread she carried. The city's fog-laden streets, once merely atmospheric, now seemed alive, curling around corners and echoing the faintest of cries. The orphan herself appeared only mildly disturbed by these occurrences, almost as if she expected them. One night, she paused outside a wealthy merchant's mansion and pressed her hand against the wrought-iron gate, whispering a name that would haunt the family for years. Inside, servants reported hearing the faint creak of footsteps where none should have been, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, and a chill that clung to the skin. Savannah's residents began to speculate that the child had awakened something ancient, a lingering spirit bound to the city's history of death and tragedy. Stories spread quickly. Some claimed that the unseen visitor was the manifestation of every life she remembered, the dead who had left unfinished business or grievances too long ignored. Others whispered that it was a warning, a spectral herald meant to show the townsfolk the consequences of ignoring her knowledge. Families barricaded windows and lit lanterns throughout the night, yet sleep offered little comfort. The orphan's presence had become inseparable from this creeping supernatural tension, and even the most skeptical found themselves questioning the solidity of the walls around them. Meanwhile, those who followed her secretly along the river and through alleys reported hearing her quiet murmurs blend with sounds no human made, soft weeping, the faint echo of a bell from a sunken ship, the sigh of an unseen breeze that carried voices of the past. Savannah had become a city haunted on two fronts, the living and the unseen, both guided by a small child who seemed untouched by fear herself. Would you have dared to stay in your home, knowing a visitor you could not see might be present with every whisper of your child's name? Could you face the unseen, guided by someone so young yet so certain? Tell me in the comments. Would you stand your ground or flee into the fog, hoping to escape what you cannot see? By the early spring of 1857, Savannah had come to a tense standstill. The orphan, once a mysterious presence among the city's streets, now commanded attention wherever she walked. Rumors had hardened into belief, and belief into dread. Those who followed her closely began to notice subtle changes, the way her eyes lingered on certain buildings, the quiet precision of her whispers, and the moments of silence that fell before her revelations. It was as if she carried not only the memory of death, but the weight of inevitability itself. One afternoon, in a dimly lit room of the orphanage, she spoke clearly to the gathered children and a few of the braver townsfolk who had dared to approach her. She described in meticulous detail not only the deaths that had already occurred, but those that would happen in the near future. Her voice, soft yet unyielding, carried the same certainty as a historian reading from an ancient manuscript. She told of the fever that would strike a servant's family, the accident waiting at the riverbank, and even the quiet passing of an elderly widow in the North District. Each revelation was accompanied by descriptions of the precise circumstances, the scent of smoke, the chill of air, the creak of floorboards. Her revelations left the listeners in stunned silence. Some wept openly, unable to reconcile the innocence of the child with the knowledge she bore. Others fell to prayer, desperate to avert the fates she foretold. The city's leaders, ministers, and physicians, though skeptical, found themselves haunted by her words. Questions circulated through Savannah. Was this knowledge a gift, a curse, or a burden too great for any human to bear? Was the orphan's insight proof of a divine will or something far older, a power rooted in the city itself. Despite the fear and awe, she remained calm, never boasting, never explaining how she knew. It was as though she understood her role in the unfolding story of the city, accepting it without malice or triumph. Her presence forced Savannah to confront its hidden past, its present vulnerability, and the inevitability of the future. The city had no choice but to reckon with her revelations, and in doing so faced its own mortality. If a child could reveal the secrets of life and death so clearly, would you believe her or deny her? Could you live knowing the future was already spoken aloud? Tell me in the comments, would you heed her warnings or turn away and hope for the best? Years passed, yet the orphan remained an indelible presence in Savannah's memory. Though she eventually left the city, her departure as quiet and mysterious as her arrival, the shadows she cast lingered. Residents still whispered of the small girl who had walked cobblestone streets with eyes that saw beyond the living, who had named the dead and foretold those yet to fall. The city, shaped by commerce and tradition, had been forever altered, its history no longer a series of forgotten tragedies, but a record vividly remembered by a child who seemed too young to bear such weight. Families recounted the precise predictions she had made, marveling at the eerie accuracy that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The riverfront, once merely a place of work and trade, became a locus of quiet superstition. Locals spoke of the fog thickening at dusk, of lanterns flickering in unoccupied rooms, as though the city itself still remembered the girl's warnings. Generations later, letters, journals, and oral histories would preserve the story, but no account could fully capture the chilling presence she had embodied. Historians who later examined records of 1857 noted anomalies, sudden deaths, precise dates, and details only someone intimately familiar with each household could know. Scholars debated whether the orphan had a gift, a curse, or an intuition born from observation, but the town's own stories insisted on something more, something beyond explanation. Savannah's legacy, once tied only to trade and culture, was now irrevocably entwined with the child who remembered every death. Even today, the streets of Savannah carry whispers of her memory. Tourists and locals alike feel a shiver beneath the moss-draped oaks, sensing the weight of countless lives recorded in silence. The orphan's story serves as a reminder: history is never truly gone, and the past can live on through the most unlikely witnesses. She had become a symbol of inevitability, a spectral chronicler of mortality, whose presence taught the living to reckon with their own fragility. If a single child could shape the memory of an entire city, would you have paid attention or dismissed it as imagination? Could you bear the knowledge of what is to come, or would you turn away from it entirely? Tell me in the comments, do you believe this was fate or something far darker?